Excellent. So next up, we've got Jens Kultima from the Danish KFST. Jens is a data science specialist in the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority, and his presentation is going to discuss the authority's BitViewer collusion detection tool. Jens, over to you.
Thank you. I'm excited. Nice. Thank you very much. And thank you, organizers, for hosting this conference. I think it's really great to gather us authorities with a technological data perspective. And I think the timing is right. I think many of us have been working perhaps a little bit siloed on very similar projects. So I really want to thank the CMA for pulling this together and for also mentioning that you want to do this regularly in the future. I want to thank my leadership team. I was specifically hired for this project about 3 years ago, and my experience has been that I was given this sandbox. It's like, we want to find cartels, go find them. And as I will hopefully show you in this presentation, it's a rather challenging task. But also, as mentioned, but I think by Flavio yesterday, it's a relatively low-hanging fruit. And I think other authorities are also joining in this relatively low-hanging fruit. And then we also mentioned, let's not just pick the low-hanging fruit, let's actually plant some trees. And I think that's really what we're aiming for with this project. It's an international collaboration. Right now, there's 5 authorities contributing to this project. We're talking to many more. And I'm really hoping that we'll be able to perhaps use this as a pilot project for how can we jointly collaborate. Bid rigging. If a public authority wants to provide a service, build a building, build a road, generally they have to do a tender process. And in that process, companies can come in with their bids and say, hey, I can build this road for this amount of money. They're also, in Denmark, not allowed to collude with each other, so agree on higher prices, or agree that we will take this part of the country and you guys can bid for that part of the country. In generally, it increases the prices. Otherwise, why would they have a cartel? And different academic studies show that sometimes it's 20%, sometimes it's 100%, but there is definitely a price increase. And here I just mentioned that 24% of the public spending in Denmark goes through this process. So there's potentially a lot of money to save. I want to jump straight into a figure. This is an output figure from the tool that we have developed. The tool is called BitViewer. And what you see here is each color representing where a company wins. These are 2 companies. We know they're the largest players on that specific market, and they have the capability of participating in all of Denmark. And then looking at this figure, it's relatively obvious to me that the yellow company wins the south and the green company wins the north. So this would be an output figure of this particular tool. And then the next question is, why do we see this pattern? And I'll get into that a little bit later as well. How do we data scientists collaborate with investigators, economists, lawyers, attorneys, judges, and other specialists to understand the patterns we see? So in brief, this may or may not be collusion. There have been many ways of identifying collusion in public procurement. There's many others than the one I'm talking about. I'm just showing this slide to essentially show that we're looking at market screens, which is a proactive approach. We collect data, and then we screen different markets, which is a slightly different approach than just collecting whistleblowers, for example. What is a screen? If someone, as we get older, we might go to the doctor and we'll have a screen for cancer, for example. In this case, when I'm talking about screens, it's essentially a method to identify collusive bidding versus non-collusive bidding. And then the technicalities would be, in the previous graph that I showed, is that collusive bidding or not? The algorithm will tell us we see this pattern, and then we have to learn whether it's collusive or not. But a screen is essentially, we want to find the companies and the tenders that are suspicious and that may collude together. I will keep this talk relatively high level, in part because there's a lot of things I want to say, and in part because we published an article. I will recommend you to read it if you are interested in the more details. So this tool, BitViewer, is designed to identify bid rigging and collusion in public procurement specifically. And I mentioned screens, so we're using different screens to identify these patterns that companies, how they're bidding. So there's bidding patterns in the article we mentioned if somebody takes turn winning. I showed you the one with the geographic market sharing. There's also non-geographic market sharing. And then we get into network methods. There are some statistical indicators. They're mentioned in the article. And those indicators can then be used to build machine learning models, which Sally talked about earlier, for example. So why have we built this tool? I think the first reason is to identify collusion where we otherwise couldn't. If we only rely on whistleblowers, we'll be very limited to those markets, and those may not be the most relevant markets. The way we built the tool is also to enable the further investigation. Screening is the first step, and then in the second step, we want to understand why do we see this pattern. So it's also a more complex tool than just running a single screen. And as we also talked about in other presentations, it's about conserving resources. And I think one of the points I really want to make here is that this is a tool we developed in Denmark. We're already collaborating with another lot of agencies. And I think, as Stefan said, the overhead of copying code to someone else is basically zero. So we're really inviting that collaboration. The way this works is we get a data set, we clean it up. That process was a little bit talked about earlier in one of the talks by David this morning. And then we run these screens. Companies and tenders are flagged, and then we inspect those flags. A question I often get is, okay, so you developed this tool, does that mean it will identify cartels and no human will look at this? No. This tool will be a supplement to the methods of how we're working. And there will always be a human part of this process. And once we have identified specific flags, specific companies or tenders, we will start and initiate a traditional case process. About planting trees. So I spent about 2 years working on this tool. It's me primarily together with a few others around Europe. And so far there's about 10, a little bit more than 10 different screens that we have implemented. And I can really see that this year we will start growing more. There's already 5 different new screens in the pipeline that we want to work on. And in collaboration with other authorities, we have another 50 ideas of things we want to implement. Leaning on Emmanuel, implementing code very modular. So this entire framework is very modular. It takes about 20 lines of code to add a new screen. All you have to do is write one single Python file, put it in a folder, and there you have it. So for me, having worked with this for a while now, it takes me 1 to 2 days to develop a new screen. So I can really see how this can go faster. So this is just an example that I ran on my laptop. This was a data set with more than 23,000 companies, 50,000 tenders, and about 900 different markets. And I ran 12 screens on my little laptop. That took 45 minutes. May not be impressive for some computer scientists. They're like, well, I can do a Google search in under a second. But we could easily run this in parallel. Then we're down to 4.5 minutes. And then we can at least see that, okay, we can rank hundreds of thousands of companies within an hour if we run this in the cloud. And each of these screens are going to be differently computer heavy. So there are some screens that are machine learning based that are relatively fast. And there's actually some screens, for example, the geographic market sharing, where you compare every pair of company and every possible pair of region over all markets. And then we're starting to get into large computational problems or computer heavy. And then we're also coming into a field where we need to have more expertise. How do we optimize these algorithms? Getting data engineers, cloud engineers, and cloud architects to how can we really do these things more and more efficient. And I think that, again, speaks into the necessity for each agency to have these capabilities, which then says, okay, so we're Denmark. There's 2 of us right now in Denmark, data scientists. And we will not be able to leverage all of that. So if we can lean on other agencies with more resources, that will support us and we can support them. And on that note, I know we're starting in a collaboration with CMA on this specific tool, which is really exciting. So I'm also looking forward to working with the CMA on this. And that brings me into this network of people that I am involved in. I put data scientists in the middle because that's from my perspective. Having made this slide, I realize it's a little counterintuitive that the red circle is the biggest one because we're generally the fewest people. So happens when you make slides. My point here is that joining this field a couple of years ago, I thought that I would be solving this computational problem by myself in a basement. And that is definitely not the case. I need to be able to communicate with the economists, the investigators, attorneys, both external and internal, public buyers, so that they know what this tool is doing and so that they can give us data in a meaningful format. And the authorities, both national and internationally, but also researchers around the world. So for me, I'm really interacting on a day-to-day basis with a wide group of people. One of the exciting wins for me in this was that I was able to present at the OECD conference Work Package 3 last year, which talks about the new guidelines for cartel detection. And in that specific document, they had only listed the winning prices. So I was able to present to the OECD and say, hey, I'm a data scientist, we're working with this. We also need the losing prices. We need to know whether companies canceled their bids, whether they were invalid, and all those types of things. So that's an example where I'm able to come with my expertise and say, hey, lawmakers, I think you're doing a great job. This is what I can contribute going forward as well. I want to give a shout out to my close collaborators because I think in this field, we are a relatively small group of people working with antitrust and working with especially bid rigging and cartel detection. So I'm happy to be joined by Daniel, who is here, Apo from Finland, who couldn't make it to the conference physically. I imagine he's listening to this now. Olof as well in Sweden, and Susanna and Alfonso. Alfonso is here. And working together with these people from different authorities, we all have different backgrounds. And I think that's really where we're starting to get a lot of work done together. And the researchers, especially David Imhoff, I think I email with David on a bi-weekly basis. And it's exciting for me as a public servant and working for the government to be working closely together with these researchers. Katie asked me, so Katie is one of the organizers of this conference, she asked me, please can you have all of your slides in size 16 so that they're readable? This is my one slide that is not size 16. My point here is that these are 18 papers on different methods for cartel detection and collusion detection. 14 of them are published in the last 3.5 years. That means all of these are published after I started to doing the research of what's out there in this field. So someone mentioned yesterday that we also need to go out to these conferences and stay on top of the game. I think I have already made my point. We're working together with a number of international authorities, one-to-one. We're talking with another 15. I'm very grateful to be working together with the US Department of Justice, to be able to present for them, and to be able to have a fruitful collaboration there. Pulling data science together. We had the first Nordic data science gathering a couple of weeks ago, hosted by us in Denmark, and we were 8 data scientists getting together, talking nerdy stuff for a couple of days, and it was really exciting. So we talked yesterday about collaboration and working together, and I'm in a position where that's what I'm already doing. So I just want to give a shout out to those who are to the lawmakers and to those who are organizing the structures we're working around, and say, hey, a platform for code sharing, a platform for data sharing, a forum where we can talk confidential information with each other, regulations and simple agreements that enables us data scientists to communicate with each other. That's really what I would like to see moving forward in the next couple of years or next year. And also technical conferences of data scientists gathering. So how do I look at this ecosystem? I look at it, I see the scientific research at the bottom. There's a great scientists out there that are doing a lot of work that we're not able to do because we don't have the time and we don't have the knowledge. And they're developing screens. I think there was a screen development recently, and all the code was published. Python code was published, including all of the data and the training sets. And I'm like, that's great. It takes me an afternoon to copy-paste that, put that in my program, and I have saved myself quite some time and effort. So the scientific community is really, really important. On top of that, I picture a layer of each of us countries developing each of our tools, which we're already doing. I talked to many different authorities, and we're battling the same challenges. And here I see, in the bid rigging space, we have invested about 3 years of my time into this project, and I'm aware of other projects around the globe solving the same problem, and getting together, talking about methods, which screens worked for you, which ones didn't work, what do you think about this one? Sharing the code, we're already doing that bilaterally, sharing data. Within the Nordic countries, we're very privileged because we have a close, tight relationship, so we can actually more closely share code and data rather easy. And seeing that internationally going forwards, I think is really an opportunity for us all. And then on top of that, sharing the methods and sharing the code, sharing cartel cases. This is a field where there's not a lot of data, and each cartel is surely going to be different. So that's another point of collaboration. And also sharing the successes, but absolutely sharing the failures. I'm moderating a session tomorrow, and I'm hoping to share some of my knowledge on both successes and failures. So I have 1 minute and 10 seconds left. And I want to talk about the pink elephant in the room. The pink elephant is the data. So we're talking about finding the needle in the haystack. It's not about finding the needle, it's about finding that haystack. As a public authority, it's challenging for us to gather data in Denmark. And some authorities have it much, much easier because they have electronic systems that are already running. And I can see in some countries it's actually moving backwards, where they now have access to the winning and the losing bids at relatively high quality, but in the coming years they will not have that because of legislation and because of how their authorities are working. So I really encourage us all to think about that. And again, every haystack is going to be different because each of these countries and cartels operate differently. So some of the training data that we're working with are publicly available. It's a cartel case from Brazil, it's one from the US, it's 3 of them from Switzerland, there's one large from Japan, and the one from the US, for example, it's an Ohio school milk case from the 1960s. And I'm like, how likely is it that that is going to be the way cartels are operating today? So that really makes it important for us to share knowledge with each other. So yeah, this is my last slide. High quality data, complementary screens. This tool is rather modular, working together, and then really learning from each other. That was me.
Jens, thank you very much. Fascinating presentation again, and lots of questions I think arising. I wanted to start by asking how concerned you are that firms might try to adapt their behavior to dodge the screens. So I mean, for instance, the map example was pretty stark, but could they do the geographical divide in a less obvious way, for example?
They could. It's a very good question. I imagine that would be one of the first questions to get. And if I Google cartel screen method, I will get a lot of already published results, scientific journals out there. So there's a lot of information already existing in that space. And I think a good screen would force the companies to behave competitively. Imagine if we were able to develop screens so that the only way they could avoid getting caught would be to actually not collude with each other. And I think we're also in a position where we have to catch the ones that are doing the obvious things. And then it will be a cat and mouse race. And we see that all over the place. But I think we're in a good position.
How do you envisage the governance and ongoing maintenance of this tool, particularly given all the collaboration you described? Is it open source and everyone can make changes, or is it people making layers on top of a foundation model? How does it work?
If I were to design a system for that, I would have a core group of developers, maybe from 3 or 4 different countries that would meet regularly. That would be the core developers of, for example, this particular tool. The way I built it was that there's a core, and then on top of that you have all the different screens. So you can add screens and you can modify things outside of the core without affecting that part. The tool is open source, and we share it with other public national competition authorities. And there will be a challenge if a lot of authorities start to making their own modifications without wanting to contribute back to a shared core. But I really hope that we can have a joint effort.
Indeed. We've already heard talk of metaphors for trying to explain some of this complex stuff this morning. So I really liked your finding the haystack one. And thinking about that finding the haystack, how cooperative have you found the public procurement authorities that you've been trying to get get the haystack from? How has that relationship worked?
I think it's a lumpy ride, to quote Sally. Sometimes good, sometimes less so. And I think much of it might be because they don't know what the tool is doing, and they don't know how we're operating or why we're doing these things. So I think communication with those, and that's also why I included them on my slide, the public buyers, because we really need to engage in a conversation with them and say, hey, we have this tool and we're actually on the same side. And yes, it might, in the beginning, add extra effort to them because there might be more importance for them to store and retain data in formats that we can use. But I think that is the way to go forward.
Thank you. And so this focuses on public procurement, which, as you described in the slides, is already a big number. And there's clearly lots of work to do in this area. What would be the next 2 or 3 areas that you would want to apply this kind of screening tool to?
I think online pricing is something that we've already talked about with the flights, for example, and I think there's a lot of other online pricing areas that we can look into, and that's also a place where there's a lot of data accessible. One example in Denmark is we have a public database of pharmaceuticals or drugs, so they have an auction every 2 weeks, and that would be another example where you could apply this.
How do you go about testing the effectiveness of different screens?
It's a very good question. I think this is where collaboration comes in, because as a sole developer, I will not be able to do all of that work. And David Imhoff, for example, he did his entire PhD working on some of these screens. So I think really engaging with the scientific community. There's also ways of designing simulated data sets where we can think about what are the possible cartel cases we can think of and see if these screens work, but also using old cartel cases, which is what we're doing.
I mean, this is a bit of a connected question. How possible is it to quantify, whether as a number or as a percentage, the successful screens that then lead to successful investigations or cases?
I'm inclined to say 42. It's possible. I mean, I think we're in the infancy of this. And I'm aware that there have been attempts previously in the past developing these tools, and I really want to underline this is not find all, catch all, perfect solution. I think this is a very good start at moving forwards. And I think when we're moving towards convincing judges and attorneys in a courtroom, having statistical models predicting, okay, how probable is it that we see this pattern? And those are things we can already do today, is say, what is the likelihood that I see this pattern, these 2 companies bidding this way?
And actually, to that point, how much have you tested these screens and the use of them in court so far, or are we before that stage?
So in Denmark, we are working on a number of leads with this case or with this tool. And again, I really think it's in the infancy, and I think moving forwards in the next couple of years is going to be very exciting.
Indeed. I think final question probably. How effective do you think public communication to firms about the use of these kinds of tools could be as part of the deterrence arsenal of authorities?
It's a choice we have made in Denmark to be open about that we are developing this tool. We're also talking specifically about some of the methods. The way I wrote that article that I mentioned is that it's a rather non-technical introduction to how are we working with this, specifically so that we're able to communicate, hey, this is a field that we're looking into.
Great. Okay, so we're going to break for lunch in a moment and ask both those here and on screens to reconvene at 1 o'clock. But before that, I'd like to thank Jens and the other 3 speakers very much for an extremely exciting and interesting morning. Thank you.